Welcome to Itasca Water's Practical Water Wisdom Series. I'm Shirley Leggering, your host for today. As you may know, Itasca Waters is a nonprofit whose goal is to educate residents in Itasca County to how to keep our water clean for both the environment and the economy. We have been teaming up with like-minded people and organizations for 14 years now, and you can read about all those projects on our website at itascawaters.org. If any of that is of interest to you, please consider becoming a member or a volunteer to help support programs like this. And we thank our partners, now shown on the screen, for their support in producing this program. The format for today's program will be Ann Nelson will speak for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll answer questions from you. To submit a question, simply click on the Q&A at the bottom of your screen and type in a brief question. You can do this at any time, and we will read the questions on your behalf. We will not be using the chat function today. The program is being recorded and will be available online for viewing on our website at itascawaters.org. Finally, we value your opinion, and so please click on the survey link, which will be on the screen at the end of the program, or you can complete a survey that will be sent to you by email, and we thank you for doing that. Today's presenter is Ann Nelson, a public health educator working for Minnesota Department of Health. She works to educate the public on private well construction, drinking water testing, and helps evaluate outreach programs to private well owners. She has a background in agricultural water quality and irrigation management. Ann's topic today is how healthy is your well? Approximately 1.2 million Minnesotans rely on private wells as their drinking water source. Starting in 1974, construction of private wells was regulated by the state of Minnesota, but any maintenance after installation is the responsibility of the owners. During this talk, you will learn the proper construction of a private well in Minnesota, issues to look for, and how often to test and maintain your drinking water. Ann, take it.
Okay. How does it look?
Yeah, it looks good, Ann. Thanks.
Perfect. Okay, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk about this topic as always. So let's dive right in. So Shirley kind of covered what I'm going to talk a little bit about, but I'm going to talk about well construction, kind of what typical wells look like in Minnesota. I'll talk about a few other differences that we can find. Groundwater protection, what you can do to protect your well, water quality, and then some water testing guidance. So in Minnesota, since we have regulations, this is what newer constructed wells will mostly look like. We have a regulation of we need that well cap 1 foot above the ground, and really that is for flooding issues, just to keep that cap safe from any water getting inside there. We would like to have a waterproof, weatherproof cap on the top with a rubber gasket, and then a well ID tag. So sometimes you'll see a well ID tag missing or a few other differences, and I'll kind of show you what those look like a little later on so you can see what to look out for. But those were our regulations now, and really that's just all to like have an identifier of the well and keep all these rodents and water and snow melt out of your drinking water source. So wells in Minnesota, most of them are these kind of sand and gravel wells. And I know you can't read the picture, which is fine, but it's just a little schematic of what it looks like. I'll do a little laser pointer here. So at the top, we have that 1 foot gap above the soil surface, that gasket and cap. And then you have your pump here, which is going to pump the water up. You have your pressure line into the house, so that it would go to your pressure tank and then feed all your faucets and shower and stuff like that. You'll have a filter down here, which we'll look at a little more. And then, so this is really going to be like your water line here, and this is all sediment. And then we usually get to these sand and gravel aquifers, which I'll talk a little bit more about as well. And that's really where we would pull our water from. So that's mostly what wells in Minnesota look like. A few other options, I'll talk about more. But I just wanted to let people kind of get a good look at what this sand and gravel screen looks like that we have where our water is coming in at on these wells. And so you can see it's just a lot of different tiny slats and holes, and that's where your water seeps in through. And so really it's not just a big open pipe to your water source, right? We don't want all this sediment and gross stuff getting in there, right? So we have to find a way to kind of filter out as much as we can all that sand and gravel that's down there, and this is a really good way to do that. And so what it's going to look like when it's installed is you'll have this fine sand, which is where the aquifer normally is, and like that's what's naturally there. And when they install these, they're going to put in coarser sand and gravel that's more coarse than these fine holes, right? So all this coarse gravel is not going to travel into there, but this stuff may. So we want to kind of make it so that all this other fine sand doesn't get into your water as well. So older wells, some of these are still around, and these would be like pre-1974 when things were regulated. But people still have older wells in their basements, which is fine. I think if the water is okay, you know, then you should be okay to go. But this is what an old piston pump well would look like. And this would be the pipe into the ground, and usually these are in the basement. And they'll just pump water up through here as a crank. We have dug wells or pit wells. So really, this is just a big hole dug in the ground. I think this is what most people think of a well is all this rock here that's just dug out, and then the water table would be sitting here, and you would pull water from here out. So we highly recommend that if you have one of these, you're not using it, or you seal it or cover it somehow, just because animals can fall in, children can fall in. They're kind of a safety hazard, and the water is really susceptible to pollution as well. So newer wells for low producing aquifers. So this could be areas where the soil is like really clay rich and water has a hard time moving through the soil, or there's just no good aquifers. And so what they'll do is they'll still have that well cap and that 1 foot distance and a pump and that screen, right? But what they're going to have here is cement blocks, cement cylinder, if you will, and there's little notches here, where they stack these on top of each other. And so water is going to be able to travel in past that gravel and into this cement casing, basically, and it's almost a storage container underground for that water. And so there's a couple different versions of those here. For a bedrock well, so we have a lot of bedrock in the Northeast, and these can be very expensive to get drilled in, right? Because they have to go quite a long ways just to make sure they get enough space in there and enough cracks for water to come in. So if we don't have any sand and gravel aquifers and we need to drill into the rock, we still have, again, that cover and that 1 foot spacing and the line to your house, right? But once we get down into that bedrock, we know there's not sand and gravel in there where water can just hang out. There's usually cracks in the bedrock. So like maybe you'll see a spring coming off the side of a mountain or something like that. That's where that water lives, is really in these cracks in the bedrock. And so they will drill a few hundred feet just so they can intercept a bunch of these different cracks on the way down. And hopefully with that, they'll be able to pull enough water into that casing so that you don't have any issues with supply. So there's some of these in Minnesota. Most of them are usually like out east in like Maine and stuff. So how do we construct a well in Minnesota? So there's a couple different ways. The most common is this mud rotary. And so this is like a big grinding unit, and they'll drill your hole with this, and water shoots out of this as well and pushes sediment and sand all the way to the top. So your hole will just all the stuff will fly out the top of the hole while you're drilling it. But they can also do that with pressurized air and a cable tool. So I'm going to show you a little graphic of kind of what this would look like. So you got your well truck that comes in, and they'll start drilling that well. And so all this stuff will come out the top. Here's a little schematic. So all that sediment and stuff's coming out the top through that pressurized water, pressurized air. And then finally they'll take that out, and they'll put in that screen that we saw earlier and the casing. And then hopefully your water is going to shoot to the top, right? There's a lot of pressure down in these aquifers, and your water will hopefully come all the way to the surface. They'll then pack that in with that coarse sand, so none of this extra sand gets in the sides. They'll then put in like a bentonite layer, a super thick clay layer, and then they'll usually fill that with grout or cement or some type of sealant in there so that all this stuff isn't getting into here, right? We don't want it to cave in or anything. We really just want the water from down here. So they'll let that harden, and about $8,000 to $20,000 later, you've got a new well. So let's talk about groundwater. So a couple definitions. So groundwater is water that is contained in soil or bedrock, and an aquifer is that area of soil or rock that contains water and transmits water. A confining layer separates different aquifers. And so this confining layer is either a soil or rock that restricts water movement. So we know that we have our water table, and then below that, we're going to have a confining layer that really stops that top layer of water from moving downward. And so it can take a long time for water on the top to move through these confining layers. So water beneath that can be 10 years old, 100 years old, hundreds of thousands of years old. It just depends on how thick that confining layer is and how deep and how permeable to water it is. So here's our landscape. We can see we have a well right here, we have a lake, and here's our water table, right? And then here's the bedrock. So this would be considered a confining layer, right? We don't think of water moving past a rock, right, very quickly. And so a lot of water is just going to sit on top of that. And this would be our aquifer, our sand and gravel aquifer here. So when we think of groundwater, I think a lot of people think it's just a big lake underground. And usually that's not the case. Usually it's pore spaces between sediment filled with water. So I really like this example of a glass jar full of marbles, and the water in between that is going to be the water you're drinking most likely. So that's kind of how aquifers work. It's not just an open space. So looking at possible sources of contamination in the water table and groundwater aquifers, so you can see our water table. We've got a couple wells, a house well, and then like a farm well here. So a few sources of contamination, we know pesticides and fertilizers get talked about a lot. But we can also have a leaky septic system from a house that needs to be looked at. A landfill is also a possible source of contamination. They're pretty heavily regulated now, but we have had issues in the past with landfills and leaching chemicals. And abandoned wells, we talked about that dug well, really like, if you're not using that well, sealing it is, we really recommend to do that because critters can get in there and other things, and that can go straight down into that water table that you're drinking. So where should you put your well, and some things to think about? So we have regulated distances your well needs to be from certain things. So like from your house, it needs to be at least 3 feet from your house. It's pretty close it can be. But like, where should I put my in-ground pool? You know, that should be at least 20 feet from your well. Or if you have a barn or a structure for animals or a feedlot, these things all have setback distances, just so those things really don't contaminate your water that you're trying to drink, right? So some of the bad news about kind of groundwater contamination, we know that water really easily dissolves contaminant, right? It's a good cleaner just by itself, right? But we know that water carries pollutants down in the ground really quickly. We know that shallow wells, so 20, 30, 40 feet deep, that are close to the surface really are prone to contamination quickly. And we know that nitrate is our most common human-controlled groundwater contaminant, and it moves really easily with water. So the good news, soil filters out a lot of forms of contamination. You know, it's a really good filter, so we like to keep it clean, right? And then we also have those confining layers that we talked about, that really thick soil layer or rock layer that can limit the downward movement of water in these surface contaminants. So really, when we suggest building a new well, we like well contractors to go down at least one confining layer. And that really helps with if there's any pollution at the surface, it kind of protects you from some of that. So some things to look for on your well. So a lot of what common issues we see is this cracked electrical conduit. So you can see there's a little gap here, here. And that'll just crack because the soil freezes in the winter and it shifts, or something moves, or it gets hit for some reason with maybe you're mowing your lawn. So if that happens, we do like people to repair it, just because this is now an open space into that weatherproof gasket. You can get spiders in there, mice in there, and that goes straight into your well. Some wells do have a wellhead vent in the screen. And so there's a mesh screen here on some of them like this, and that just lets gas out from the well. Sometimes this will get nicked, or something will build up on there, or it'll erode. And so if you do have that, not everybody has it. If you do have that, just make sure that's kind of intact. Again, we don't want any rodents or anything getting in there. So a cracked casing or something like this, where the gasket and weatherproof cap has popped off the top, I would say that's probably a pretty immediate need to fix. And so, because this is just going to be a really open space, rain can get in there, snow melt, a flood, or again, rodents have a straight shot down into your water supply. So if you do see something like that, I'd probably call somebody right away. Some things to think about is flooding. And so you can see this little well here is barely making it. And really that 12 inches we recommend is really because of flooding, and to keep the water out. And so if your well does flood and you get water above that waterproof cap, we recommend testing for bacteria right away. And in the meantime, finding a different water source. So what should I be concerned about in my private wells for testing? So we have recommendations, and we have 5 things we really want all people to test for. So coliform bacteria, nitrate, arsenic, lead, and manganese, and those are at different intervals. And really what we want people to know is most of the time you can't smell, see, or taste any of these contaminants, right? They're kind of invisible. So I'm going to go through all 5 of those, little health risks, what you can do. So coliform bacteria, we say to test once a year for this. What should you do, like what level should you take action at is really any detection of bacteria. We know that it can cause some gastrointestinal issues. People can get pretty sick if there's a lot of bacteria in your well. And what are the sources of bacteria? So usually maybe we have a leaky septic system, or some sort of rodent may have gotten into your well, or some sort of animal is possibly dead around your well. We just say inspect your well to see if something's going on, or check maybe if there's a leaky septic system that could be impacting your well. Usually those are the sources. So coliform bacteria themselves pose little to no health risk, but they are an indicator of another problem. So usually E. coli is the big problem that we see, and that's just from feces of a warm-blooded animal or a septic leak. So if you do test for coliform, we suggest going back and testing for E. coli, and most labs will test for both in the first place right away. So if you do get coliform in your well, of course, remove the issue or fix the issue, get your drinking water from another source, and then we say to disinfect your well. We can, licensed well contractor is a really good option to help you do this. There is some guidance on MDH's website for you to do this by yourself. So it's really up to you what you would like to do. So for nitrate, our action level, health risk level is 10 parts per liter. So that's 10 parts per million. The health impacts is really for children under 6 months. Those are at the highest risk. And they get what's called methemoglobinemia or blue baby syndrome. And so it really intercepts the oxygen in their bloodstream, and they basically suffocate because there's no oxygen able to flow through their bloodstream because the nitrate is kind of taken over. And so they'll literally just turn blue. It was a bigger problem back in the day in the 80s, 50s, 60s, 80s. We've gotten a lot better at identifying it now and providing guidance to mothers and families, but it can also have some impacts long-term on adults if it's at high enough levels for a long enough time. So where do we get nitrate from? Usually fertilizer, that's our biggest source, but also feedlots is another source, and then septic tanks. So we recommend testing every year for nitrate as well. And so where is nitrate a huge problem? So we can see in the central area of the state, it gets pretty high just because there's a lot of sand here, right? And so we know nitrate moves really good with water, and water moves very fast in the sands, right? And then we also know in the southeast, we have this karst geology. So we think of the bedrock there as like Swiss cheese. There's just a lot of holes for water to move through, and it gets into people's drinking water very quickly. So if you have nitrate above this 10 parts per million, say get another drinking water source, especially for infants under 6 months old. Inspect your system to make sure that septic tank isn't leaking. Remove potential sources of nitrate near your well. So maybe there's a bag of fertilizer sitting next to your well, and that's it's getting rained on and it's leaking into your groundwater. So removing some of those. If your groundwater is naturally high in nitrates, or you have something out of your control in your area, we recommend a reverse osmosis system. It's probably the best option. Distillation and anion exchange are all good treatments for high nitrates. So for arsenic, Arsenic is naturally occurring in our soil and rocks. It's just a natural mineral, and some places have it in their groundwater, some places don't. So our action level with nitrate is really any detection at all of nitrate. So we know arsenic is a human carcinogen, but we strongly recommend treatment above 10 parts per million, right? So we can't regulate anybody to treat their water, but we know 10 parts per million is kind of this threshold where things start to get serious. And so if you have the means to treat with any detection, we recommend that. Anything over 10 is really strongly recommended. So we know it causes increased risk of cancer, blood or liver, bladder cancer, lung and liver cancer. We know it causes a lower IQ in children, higher risk of diabetes, higher risk of heart disease. So a lot of pretty gnarly things. And really these are over long-term periods of time. So for testing, we recommend at least once you test for this. And if you are getting a new well drilled, they are required to test for this as of 2008, and then they will provide the results to you. If you do get a detection and it's a new well, we also recommend testing 6 months later, because sometimes things settle out, the system starts kind of equalizing, and your detection level may go down. So just a few things to think about. So test at least once, especially if you're drilling a new well, and then also, if you move to a new location and you're unsure of what the water is like there. Where is arsenic detected in Minnesota? Kind of all over. There's really not a lot of clear patterns. So we know that there was a Des Moines lobe way back in the glaciated period that covered inside this red area, and we kind of see some pattern here of where those dark blue dots are compared to the light blue, but it's really all over the state. There are issues with arsenic. So if you do detect arsenic, we recommend considering a home water treatment system. So an RO system is great. Distillation in an absorptive media is also pretty common. So for lead, and action level for lead, any detection of lead, we recommend getting some sort of treatment or replacing plumbing. So we know health impacts from lead are really for babies, young children, pregnant women are most at risk. It causes damage to the brain, kidney, nervous system. Our sources for this one, though, is a little different than arsenic, right? So arsenic is natural. Lead is really only found in our plumbing. So if you have an older home where they were using lead lines, that's where the lead is coming from. Or if you're in the city and you have a lead service line, that's where it's going to be coming from. So how do we recommend treating on this one is really replacing that lead plumbing or lead service line. So for testing, we say at least once, especially if you're moving into an older home. So if you have detected lead, one thing you can do is let your water run for about 30 to 60 seconds just to flush all that water out that's been sitting in those pipes overnight, right? So otherwise, if you have the means to replace that lead component, that's going to be your best option, and that's going to solve the issue. So for home water treatment, again, reverse osmosis, distillation, some carbon pitcher filters are good. Otherwise, an alternate water source. Manganese, this is different levels for different ages. So under 1 is 100 micrograms per liter. This is also parts per billion. Older than 1 year old is 300 parts per billion. So we know long-term exposure causes deficits in memory, attention span, motor skills. And then we know that manganese is also natural in soil or rock, so you can't really get rid of it. For testing, we say at least once, and then before a baby drinks the water. And where is manganese? We have a few hot spots. Probably 3/4 of the state has some pattern of manganese in it. We know the Southeast has a bunch of different geology, and so it's a lot lower occurrence there. And then in the Northwest, it's a little different. But If you have a manganese level that is unsafe, so we say use a different water source, especially for babies and young children, and then consider a home water treatment system. So finding a laboratory to test your water for you, we have certified labs throughout the state, and you can go to MDH's website. You can type in MDH well testing, and it should pop up into Google. You can also ask your environmental or public health services in your county if they provide well water testing. So some places will provide a screening clinic, usually hosted through the SWCD, the Soil Water Conservation District. You might have some community events that are going on that will screen for nitrates and usually chloride, which is an indicator of bacteria. So if you're looking for something and you're not quite sure, that might be a good place to start. Otherwise, get in contact with an accredited lab in your area. So how do you take a water sample collection? I've gotten this question a few times. Do I bring it in a glass jar? How do I fill it up? I rinsed out the spaghetti jar. Is that okay? So it depends on what you're looking for. So if we do a screening clinic, really just a clean jar is okay. If you are doing an accredited certified lab test, they go to the lab and pick up sample containers. They usually give you sterile containers, and then you fill that up and bring that back to the lab. So for a lot of the directions for that is get as close to the well as possible. So whether that's your kitchen sink, your bathroom sink, the most regularly used faucet, right? Because that's where you're drinking your water from. We would also like to know before your water treatment device. So whether that's maybe a water softener or you have an RO system already, try to take a sample before that. We know we want to remove any faucet screens or rubber washers that are on there, and then either flame that faucet for a while or disinfect with alcohol, because that'll get rid of some of the bacteria that's kind of hanging out in there. And then we want you to run your cold water for about 5 minutes. And that really just cleans out all of your plumbing and gives us a good sample of what you're actually drinking from the aquifer. So what can I do to help ensure a good drinking water system? So we know our contamination points are groundwater and then broken and inadequate wellhead construction, plumbing issues, so that's the lead, and then making sure your plumbing lines are really installed by a professional or you know what you're doing, so there's not any cross contaminations going on there. So one thing we like to promote at Department of Health is this tips. So test your water, inspect your well, protect your well, and seal any unused wells is our recommendation. So some folks have questions on where can I find information about my well? Maybe I just moved here to a new place, or I'm not quite sure. So we do have the Minnesota Well Index at the Department of Health, and you can go online and it's an interactive map and you can search your address, and hopefully if you have a private well that is after 1974, it will show up in there. So sometimes it sounds like it took a while for contractors to get used to the regulations in the 70s and submitting their paperwork. Some paperwork was unrecognizable and unreadable. So hopefully your well is in there if you do have a private well. If it's not in there, you can contact a well driller, a licensed well driller, and they may be able to help you out and give you some answers on what your well looks like. And that is all I have. So I'll be ready for some questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Anne. That was very, very interesting since I have a well myself. So
yeah.
And now we'll go to Bill Granches for our Q&A portion. Bill is the director of the Itasca County AIS program and a longtime board member of Itasca Waters. Bill?
Thank you, Shirley. Before we get started, you can submit your questions using the Q&A function in writing. do not use the chat function. Now, it's possible that we might group some similar questions together. Also, if we don't get to your question, contact us, send us an email, and we'll get a response back to you as soon as we can. All right, let's start. The first question here for Anne. Anne, can a well be too shallow or too deep, or does it all depend on the confining layer?
Sure. So a licensed well contractor in your area is really going to be your best source of information on how deep your well should be and what the best water source is. So really, in the whole regulation of private wells, we regulate construction, and that's about it. Everything after that is all you. If you want to drink the water, that's on you, right? So if you have a sand point well, like a lot of people put in back in the 90s, and you're drinking out of that, and that's 20 feet, that's your choice, right? So I think it's fine if you can get adequate water from whatever source you need to get from. It's really the testing of contaminants in that water, of what are you okay with. So a lot of people do have 20-foot deep sandpoint wells, and their drinking water is fine, and they feel comfortable with that. And I think, that's a personal decision. Too deep, I think your well contractor is probably just going to go where they feel comfortable and where they feel like you have a good source and a clean source. So
terrific.
Yeah.
Okay, next question. I'm sorry, I just read it. I'm like, really? I don't have any faucets before my softener. So how do I collect my sample from my faucet if I'm supposed to collect it before my water softener?
Sure. So there's probably a point before the softener that comes from your pressure tank to your softener. So I would say collect it before then, if you can get it at that point. Otherwise, I think some labs will ask if you have a treatment system, and if you've taken the sample after that. I think just being cognizant of where you take your sample from. It's not a deal breaker if you take it after the water softener.
What do you think about using the bypass function on a water softener?
Yeah, see, that would also work as a good option. We just don't want you to get blown away by all that pressurized water coming out there.
Been there, done that. Been there, done that. Okay, next question. Are home testing kits okay to use?
Great question. So at MDH, we like to call those screenings for contaminants, which is a difference between that accredited certified lab that's going to have really dialed in equipment and sterile containers. That's what you're going to get in an accredited lab. And those results are going to be a lot more accurate. At home water tests, they give you a general idea of what is there. And I think they're a really great starting point for someone. But again, it's going to be kind of a guesstimate. That's usually how close these at-home tests can get.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, I think I saw the answer to this one on one of your slides. Can we cap our well with a fake rock or landscaping rocks, etc.?
Okay, so I would prefer to say no. I think if you put something over top of it, that's really going to help with a lot of safety issues. But we really would like to see old abandoned wells sealed. And so what they would do is put in some sort of cement into that well and seal it so water can't go up or down, and floodwaters can't get in there, snow melt, stuff like that. So that's really a lot of the big concern, is stuff kind of seeping into the cracks and going down into your well. And remember, mice, they can dislocate all their body parts. They just got to get their head through that hole. So we've seen some pretty gross stuff. Yeah, but great question.
Okay, thank you. Our next question, do you have any concerns that we turn off our water pump for a week or more while we're away from our cabin? We do this so if there's a break in an appliance problem and the cabin doesn't flood. Actually, I do the same thing myself. Do you have any concerns about that?
So I haven't looked into this a whole lot, but let me tell you, there is a switch you can put on your pressure tanks, like a safety switch. And so if there is an issue, it will automatically shut it off. But I don't see a reason why it wouldn't be okay to shut that off. I would just recommend when you do come back to kind of flush your plumbing out,
Yeah.
so we know a lot of bacteria starts to grow in there if it sits stagnant for too long.
Sure.
Yeah.
Also, I'd add to that also turn your electricity off or if you have an electric water heater. Okay. How much do drought conditions affect wells?
Yeah, so great question, very timely. So we know, hopefully with newer wells, they're deep enough and in deep enough aquifers that there shouldn't be too much interference with drought in Minnesota. However, we are seeing a lot of pumping interferences with agriculture right now, right? Especially in the Northwest, where a lot of new wells irrigation wells have come online and they've pumped more than they have been allowed to pump. And so in that instance, you can contact the DNR and they will help you with something like that if you think that's going on.
Sure.
But yeah, if you have a shallow well, I'd probably try to be careful about your water use in the summer, whether that's, cutting your shower shorter or growing a smaller garden, because we know that it takes a lot of water. I think being mindful of your water use is always good.
Very good. Next question. I occasionally get a rotten egg smell, but adding chlorine seems to take care of it for several months. Should I be concerned?
Yeah, so rotten egg smell, couple different ways to tackle that. So sometimes there is sulfur bacteria in your aquifer, and there's really not a whole lot you can do to deal with that, which I think is maybe where this person has an issue. That would be like you'd have to drill a different well into a different aquifer to take care of that issue. Also, sometimes we get sulfur bacteria buildup in plumbing. And so if you don't use something for a while, maybe it's your cold water in your bathroom or something, and you get that kind of rotten egg smell. It's really just in the plumbing that the bacteria is kind of thriving. And so one way you could do that is to disinfect, take that plumbing out and disinfect it. That would solve that issue. There's also the heating rod in your water heater can also build up with this sulfur bacteria. And so changing that out could also be a good option, and maybe that's where it's coming from. But that would be really if like you only notice it with hot water.
Hot water.
That would be where your water heater is coming from. So yeah, multiple different ways that's happening.
Yeah, I had that exact situation with my electric hot water heater, and changing it out took care of the problem.
Yeah, but we also know that even though it's really stinky, it's not a health concern. So
yeah,
it's fine to drink. It just smells kind of gross.
But still, when you're cooking. But
yeah.
Anyway, okay, yeah. All right. Next question. You said a well can be as old as long as its water is safe. So how does that mean? Sorry. So does that mean that a well doesn't necessarily need to be re-drilled every 50 years?
Okay, so I'm going to go back to my comment of this is kind of the Wild West, and if you want to drink the water, that's up to you. I think we say 50 years probably because that's a good lifespan of some of the pumps and the plumbing and codes being updated. There are a lot of people that have really like 100-year-old wells and they're still drinking from it and they're fine. So it's really up to you as the well owner of what you're comfortable with and drinking from.
Okay. Next question. Who do we contact if you know someone's feedlot is leaching into a river?
Sure, great question. So the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency is going to manage that. So they'll help you, if that is the case, they'll help you investigate the situation, and they'll see if that's actually the contaminant source, and they'll do some testing, and if needed, they'll help remediate the situation. So the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency is going to be your best bet on that one.
Very good. I'm scanning through here to see if we have any more. We have a couple more questions. Actually, we are going to answer this one in our next session, but where can I find the recording for this webinar? We will touch on that. Shirley will when we get through the question and answer function here. So that'll be answered at that time. All right, next question. If it's the Wild West and we can choose a drinking and we choose, wow, I'm not doing so great today. I had COVID 2 weeks ago. If it's the Wild West and we can choose to drink bad water, are there local laws that protect us from ourselves drinking bad water?
So I'm going to be honest, it's probably no. I had a lady last week ask me if she's okay to keep drinking her lake water at their cabin. So if you want to drink it, have at it, but I would not recommend something.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that covers it for our questions, and thank you very much. I'm going to turn this back over to Shirley. Shirley, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Bill, and thank you, Ann. And if you would like to watch this program again or recommend it to a friend, you can watch it on itascawaters.org. It will take a few days for us to get it posted on that site. And again, we'd love to get your feedback. So click on the survey link at the end of the program, or we'll email you an evaluation form by email. And we would really appreciate you hearing from you. Our next program will be on October 31st, and our speaker will be Dr. John Downing, Director of Minnesota Sea Grant out of Duluth. He will be speaking about supernatural lakes, monsters, ghosts, witches, fairies, and aliens. There will not be a program on the first Thursday in October. I'm Shirley Leggering, and thanks for being with us today.